There are moments in life that do not begin with shouting. No tears hit the floor, no doors slammed shut in anger. They begin very quietly. Just a man sitting still in his car, parked in front of the house he once called home, repeating in his head a single lie, one he knows will change his entire life. Jason Reed, 36 years old, sat there exactly like that. The engine had been off for a long time. The warm yellow light from the porch spilt across the windshield, forming faint, blurred streaks. In that moment, nothing dramatic happened, and yet the silence itself felt suffocating. 3 months later, Jason would sign divorce papers, but right now, he still hadn't stepped out of the car. He was preparing to lie. "Megan, I got fired today." 5 words, short, simple. But Jason understood perfectly that those 5 words were not an innocent lie. They would shatter an illusion he had lived inside for nearly 5 years. They would strike at the deepest part of his marriage, the place where he had begun to suspect that numbers, timelines, and cold calculations had replaced love. Jason was not the kind of man who tested people's hearts. He wasn't suspicious by nature. He didn't check his wife's phone. He didn't monitor her messages. He didn't ask questions without reason. From the outside, his life looked like a familiar model of a middle-aged American man moving steadily along the right path. A stable job in logistics, a salary good enough not to worry about every bill, a townhouse in the suburbs of Denver, quiet evenings, short vacations once a year. Megan, his wife, was 4 years younger. She worked part-time as a Pilates and wellness instructor. She had a pleasant appearance, a gentle way of speaking, and a positive social circle. They weren't wealthy, but they were comfortable. Jason had believed that their marriage didn't need to be perfect, only honest. And he had believed that with complete sincerity. But as in many other stories, nothing collapsed in a single moment. It cracked slowly. The first changes were so small that Jason convinced himself they didn't matter. Megan began to tense up whenever he mentioned his mother coming to stay for a few days. She started asking more questions about his 401k, about his life insurance, about the investments Jason had built before they ever met. Not questions asked once out of curiosity, but repeated inquiries, detailed enough to make him uneasy. Then Megan began going out more often with Lauren, her close friend who had just gone through a bitter divorce, a friend who frequently talked about her settlement money in a tone that hovered somewhere between pride and resentment. Jason didn't react. He didn't confront her. He didn't openly question her motives. He observed. He told himself that maybe his wife was under some pressure, or maybe she was changing, the way everyone eventually does. But deep inside, a sense of unease began to take shape. It wasn't clear. It had no name. But it was enough to make him no longer feel entirely at peace. Everything crossed Jason's threshold one very ordinary afternoon. A pounding headache forced him to come home earlier than usual. When he opened the door and stepped inside, he hadn't even called out to his wife yet when he heard Megan's voice coming from the kitchen. Her tone was completely different from how she spoke to him. Not gentle, not distant, but fast, sharp, and filled with a strange urgency. "I just need to wait a little longer. Once we pass the 5-year mark in our marriage, the alimony calculation changes completely. My lawyer already told me." Jason froze. His heart sank. Those words weren't meant for him, but they pierced straight through him. The sound of Jason's footsteps ended the call abruptly. Megan turned around, and her familiar smile appeared so quickly that, without paying attention, one might assume it was a natural reflex. She asked why he was home early. Jason said he had a headache, took some medication, and went into the bedroom. But that night he couldn't sleep. Not because of anger, not entirely because of heartbreak, but because of a cold feeling slowly spreading through his chest. The realization that the person beside you every day may have left long ago. They just haven't walked out of the house yet. Jason understood that if he confronted her directly, he would only receive carefully prepared denials. If he lost his temper, he would be turned into the suspicious one, and if he stayed silent forever, he would be the one trapped in a situation already decided. So he chose a different path, a path that wasn't beautiful, it wasn't romantic, but it was necessary. He decided to test the truth. Not for revenge, but to know the truth, to know where he truly stood in this marriage. That was why Jason sat in his car that night, in front of the familiar house, practicing a lie he wished he never had to say. "Megan, I got fired today." He took a deep breath, opened the car door, and stepped inside. And from that moment on, the real story began. Jason stepped into the house with the posture of a man carrying bad news. He deliberately set his briefcase down, a little more complicated than usual, as if its weight wasn't just paperwork, but the burden of an entire failed day. Megan was sitting on the sofa, a laptop resting on her thighs, blue light casting across her face. When she heard the door, she looked up. In that very brief moment, Jason noticed something he had never paid close attention to before. A flicker of irritation passed through her eyes, so fast that, if you weren't watching carefully, you'd think you imagined it. Then it vanished immediately, replaced by a look of just enough concern. "You're home early?" Megan asked. Her voice was gentle but slightly higher than usual. Jason nodded, swallowing hard. He had practiced this sentence dozens of times in the car, but facing Megan, his throat went dry. "Yeah, today didn't go well. Megan, we need to talk." She set the laptop aside and crossed her legs on the couch. "What's going on? You look exhausted." Jason took a deep breath, trying to make his voice tremble just enough, not dramatic, not too calm. I got fired today." He paused for a beat, then continued. "The company is cutting staff. They eliminated my entire department." For a brief second, Megan's face went blank. Not shocked, not sad, more like someone had flipped a switch inside her. Then emotions rushed in quickly, but not in the order Jason had expected. Surprise first, then confusion, and finally, something resembling fear buried very deep. "What?" Megan said sharply. "How is that even possible? You've been there 6 years." "I know," Jason replied, shaking his head slightly. "But they said it's budget-related, not performance. Either way, there's nothing I can do about it now." He sat down in the chair across from her, deliberately keeping his distance. "We're going to have to rework everything, Megan. I've got about 3 months of severance, then unemployment benefits. We might have to sell the house, move somewhere cheaper." Jason looked straight at his wife as he said this. He didn't miss a single detail on her face. He saw the color drain from Megan's skin, her lips pressed together, her hands clenched unconsciously. "Sell the house?" Megan repeated, as if the words carried an entirely different meaning now. "Jason, we can't decide something like that so quickly." "We may not have a choice," he said quietly. "And my investment account too. I might have to withdraw from it while I look for a new job. The job market isn't easy right now. It could take 6 months or longer." That was the moment Jason knew he hadn't imagined anything. Megan stood up abruptly from the couch as if she couldn't stay seated for another second. She paced a few steps across the living room, then turned back, avoiding his eyes. I need time to process this," Megan said quickly. "I need to. Call Lauren. I need to talk to someone." "That's fine," Jason replied, forcing his voice to soften. "I'll be in the study." Megan nodded but didn't look at him. She grabbed her phone, hurried upstairs, and closed the bedroom door behind her. Jason counted silently. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. 30 seconds. Then he stood up and walked upstairs so quietly that he surprised even himself. He stopped outside the bedroom door, pressing close to the wall. The phone in his pocket was recording. Megan's voice came almost immediately, low and urgent. "Lauren, something happened. Jason says he got fired." "No, I'm not joking." A short pause. Then Megan continued, her voice dropping even lower. I know. But this ruins everything. If he doesn't have a job, alimony will be calculated based on unemployment or whatever lousy job he gets next. I might end up with nothing." Jason felt his heart pounding so hard he could almost hear it in his ears, but he didn't move. He listened. "We still have 7 months until the 5-year mark," Megan said, frustration filling her voice. 7 months, Lauren. Do you think I can live with him for another 7 months like this? And what if he can't find a good job? My lawyer was very clear. The calculation is based on income at the time of separation. Another pause. Jason imagined Lauren speaking on the other end. Megan exhaled sharply. "No, I can't file now. That would mean all this waiting was for nothing. We planned this carefully. We wait until 5 years, then we do it." Jason heard Megan listing things off, calmly, terrifyingly so. He's got an investment account with about 40-something thousand. His 401k is close to $100,000. Split in half, plus alimony calculated off a near 6-figure salary, I could walk away with over $200,000. That was the plan. In that moment, Jason no longer felt pain. A layer of ice covered all his emotions. The numbers Megan spoke weren't just money. They were proof. Proof that what he feared was true. "You're asking if I have other options?" Megan continued. "I could stay and hope he finds a good job quickly. But what if he only makes $60,000? I waited all that time to get what? No, that would be stupid." Then her voice slowed, dropping lower. "Honestly, I stopped loving him a long time ago. Probably over a year now. Jason is boring, Lauren. He comes home, watches TV, talks about boring coworkers, and goes to bed at 10 like a 60-year-old man. I'm only 32. I don't want to live like that forever." Jason closed his eyes. Every word felt like a blade. But strangely, he didn't collapse. Maybe because deep down, he had already prepared for this. "Money is just what I deserve," Megan went on coldly. "For 4.5 years of putting up with that mediocrity." Jason turned around and walked back down the stairs as quietly as he had come up. He went into the study and closed the door. When he stopped the recording, his hands trembled. Not from sadness, but from an evident, very sharp feeling. Betrayal had taken shape. It was no longer vague. He sat down in the chair, leaning back, staring into the space in front of him. The woman he married wasn't just preparing to leave him. She was preparing to leave him. She had been planning it for a long time, waiting for the perfect moment to maximize her gain. The marriage he believed was built on love was, to her, nothing more than an investment waiting to mature. A few minutes later, Megan came downstairs. Her face had been carefully rearranged. The gentle, worried expression had returned as if no phone call had just taken place. She placed a hand on Jason's shoulder. "I'm sorry I disappeared earlier. This news is really shocking." Jason looked up and forced himself to smile. "I understand." "We'll get through this," Megan said softly. "For better or worse, we're still a team, right?" Her hand on his shoulder sent a chill through him, but he didn't push it away. He nodded slowly. "Yeah." A team. In his mind, a thought rang out clearly. Some people say we only when it still benefits them. And some truths only reveal themselves when you pretend to lose everything. That night, when Megan went to bed early, Jason sat alone in the study, dim light falling across the empty wall. He no longer doubted. He was no longer confused. He knew exactly what he needed to do next. And from that moment on, Jason's marriage, in reality, had already ended, even though on paper it would continue to exist for a bit longer. That night moved more slowly than any night Jason had ever experienced. After Megan had fallen asleep, or at least pretended to, Jason remained alone in the study. The desk lamp cast its light onto the smooth wooden surface where he had once signed the necessary contracts and planned a future he believed belonged to two people. Now that room had become the place where he faced the truth. There was no more doubt, no more hypotheses. What he had heard on the staircase that night had closed the last remaining doors of innocence inside him. Jason didn't turn on the music. He didn't switch on the TV. He just sat there and let the silence do its work. And in that silence, he realized something strange. He wasn't crying. He wasn't angry. There was no emotional storm like people often imagine when betrayal is revealed. Instead, there was a cold clarity, like the moment you wake up after a long dream and realize you've been living inside it for far too long. The truth didn't break him. It made him stand straighter. Jason replayed every detail from the past few months, and suddenly everything fell into place, cruelly logical. The questions about money were no longer harmless. Megan's evenings out were no longer everyday social needs. Even the way she had suddenly become gentler whenever he talked about the future took on a different meaning. That wasn't love being rekindled. That was the patience of someone waiting for the right moment. At nearly 2 a.m, Jason picked up his phone and stared at his contacts for a long time before making the call. The person on the other end answered after 2 rings, sounding more alert than he expected. Jason? It was Angela Whitman, a family lawyer he had been referred to long ago by a friend in a conversation Jason had never imagined he would actually need. He didn't rant. He didn't complain. Jason spoke slowly and clearly, recounting everything he had seen, everything he had heard, every number Megan had mentioned, as calmly as if he were describing an investment portfolio. Angela remained silent for a long moment, then let out a quiet breath. What you're describing, she said, is called financial opportunism within a marriage. And no, Jason, you're not imagining it. The next day, Jason went to work as usual. He drove to the office, greeted his coworkers, attended the morning meeting. He even made coffee for the team, just like always. No one noticed anything different. And that, in itself, helped him understand another truth. Many of the greatest personal tragedies in life go completely unnoticed by the outside world. You can be falling apart and still be on time, still do your job, still smile when expected. At lunchtime, Jason met Angela at her office. The space wasn't dramatic like in the movies. No dim lighting, no heavy background music. Just a bright, tidy room and a middle-aged woman speaking in a calm, professional tone. That calmness made Jason feel safe. Angela didn't ask whether he still loved Megan. She didn't ask whether he wanted to save the marriage. She asked only what was necessary. Length of the marriage. Separate assets, joint assets, each person's income. And finally, she asked, "Do you have evidence?" Jason said he had an audio recording. Angela nodded, not surprised. She explained the recording laws, how such evidence could be used, and, most importantly, what it represented. The recording isn't just words, Angela said. It shows intent. And in family law, intent carries significant weight. Jason left the law office with a list of things to do, but without any sense of urgency. He was no longer reacting emotionally. He began thinking strategically, the same way Megan had, but with one crucial difference. He wasn't trying to take more than he deserved. He wanted to make sure nothing was taken from him that had never belonged to her. That evening, Megan cooked dinner. The familiar dishes, the familiar presentation, the familiar voice. She asked Jason about his workday, about where he had applied for jobs, about the exact amount of his severance pay. Jason answered just enough. He noticed that Megan listened closely to the numbers, not to his feelings. She nodded, calculating silently, occasionally pressing her lips together as if doing mental arithmetic. When Megan placed her hand over his and said, "Everything will be okay," Jason almost laughed. Not out of sarcasm, but because of the irony. Some words of comfort only have meaning when they're spoken out of concern for another person, not out of concern for oneself. In the days that followed, Jason lived in a state of double consciousness. On the outside, he was the husband who had just lost his job, trying to stay positive, sending resumes, reading job listings, discussing expenses. On the inside, he was collecting pieces. Credit card statements, the timing of Megan's meetings with her lawyer, small changes in her routines. Every detail was placed carefully where it belonged, not to accuse, but to protect. There were moments when Megan smiled at him, and Jason felt a faint flicker of doubt. A part of him wanted to believe it was all a misunderstanding, that the woman in front of him was still the woman he married. But then he remembered that voice on the phone, when he wasn't there. A voice that wasn't performing, that didn't need to hide. And he understood that real love doesn't need to be proven by waiting for a financially advantageous milestone. One evening, after Megan had gone to bed, Jason stood alone on the back porch. The Denver air was cool. He looked at the surrounding houses, warm yellow light glowing from their windows, and wondered how many people inside were living with the same truth he was. How many marriages looked stable on the outside, but inside were nothing more than a waiting period before leaving at the right time. Jason no longer asked why. That question wouldn't move him forward. Instead, he asked, "What do I do next?" And for the first time in days, he felt something close to control returning. Not control over someone else, but control over his own life. He understood that this marriage, though not yet over on paper, was already finished emotionally. And sometimes the most painful thing isn't losing someone. It's realizing they left a long time ago, leaving you behind with promises that had lost all value. Jason went back inside, turned off the lights, and climbed into bed beside Megan. The distance between them was only a few inches, but it had never felt greater. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to prepare for what was to come. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but at least, from this moment on, he was no longer walking in the dark. The days that followed passed with a strange rhythm, as if life on the outside continued to function normally, while inside, Jason had already shifted onto a different trajectory. He woke up on time every morning, made coffee, read the news, drove to the office, attended meetings, answered emails, smiled at the right moments. No one knew that behind that calm exterior was a man methodically dismantling his own marriage with a cold clarity he had never possessed before. Jason no longer acted on emotion. He acted on certainty. In the evenings when he returned home, he observed everything more carefully than ever. The way Megan set her handbag down on the table. The way she asked questions sounded caring, but always circled back to money, time, and future scenarios that benefited her. "Did you apply for any more jobs today? Did you ask your old company if they could refer you? Exactly how much is the severance again?" Each question was phrased in a gentle tone, but Jason recognized that they did not stem from concern for him. They came from the need to update the variables in a calculation running quietly inside Megan's mind. He began keeping records, not obsessively, but systematically. The nights Megan came home late. In the afternoons, she said she was teaching extra classes, while credit card statements showed meals at a restaurant near a law office district. The subtle shifts in how she spoke about the future, using I more often than we. Jason didn't judge. He documented. Because he understood one thing clearly. The truth doesn't need exaggeration. It only needs to be placed in the correct order. There were moments of weakness when Jason saw Megan smile or when she spoke with genuine excitement about a new client. In those moments, he wondered if he was being too cold, if everything might be a series of misunderstandings that were too perfectly aligned. But then he remembered her voice during that phone call that night. Not the voice of someone confused, the voice of someone who had thought long and carefully, and who was convinced she was doing what was right for herself. Jason met Angela again over the weekend. He handed her the recording, the credit card statements, and his notes. Angela reviewed everything carefully, without haste. When she looked up, she said something Jason would never forget. "You don't need to prove that she's a bad person. You only need to prove that she wasn't acting in the interest of the marriage." In the eyes of the law, that distinction can matter more than any accusation. Angela guided Jason step by step, not to retaliate, but to protect. To protect what he had built before the marriage began. To protect his right to leave this marriage without being turned into a financial resource for a plan he had never agreed to. Jason realized that, in a way, he and Megan were playing the same game. The only difference was that he had just learned the rules, while she had been playing for a long time. At home, Megan began showing more concern. She cooked Jason's favorite meals. She suggested reviewing the budget together, planning how to get through this difficult phase. She talked more about teamwork, about how marriage meant facing challenges together. If those words had been spoken a few months earlier, Jason might have been moved. Now, they sounded like a rehearsed script. Perfect timing, perfect delivery, perfect role. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, Megan studied Jason for a long moment before speaking, her voice slower and lower than usual. "Do you ever think that everything happens for a reason?" Jason nodded. "I do." Megan smiled, as if his answer confirmed something inside her. Jason understood that, in Megan's mind, reason wasn't about understanding each other better. It was about justifying the steps she planned to take next. Jason began preparing for the confrontation, though he wasn't in a hurry. He knew that the most critical moment wasn't when the truth was spoken, but when it was spoken at the right time. With each passing day, he became more certain that his decision was correct, not because Megan had been calculating, but because he could no longer live in a relationship where asset values and legal timelines measured love. One night, Jason woke up at 3 a.m. Megan was asleep, her back turned toward him. Moonlight filtered through the gap in the curtains, casting a pale gray wash across the room. Jason looked at the woman beside him for a long time. He remembered their wedding day, the way Megan smiled while reciting her vows, the way she held his hand tightly. He didn't deny that the love had once been real, but he also couldn't deny that it had become distorted. And the most painful part wasn't the change itself. It was that one person had chosen to turn love into a tool. The next morning, Jason took the first step in the plan Angela had outlined. He went to the bank, opened a separate account, transferred exactly the portion the law allowed, no more, no less. He updated beneficiary information on essential documents. Everything happened quickly, without drama. But for Jason, it was the moment he officially reclaimed control of his life. When he returned home that evening, Megan behaved as usual. She asked what he had accomplished during the day. Jason answered briefly. He didn't tell another lie. He didn't tell the truth either. He maintained strategic silence because he understood that some conversations don't need to happen immediately. Silence, sometimes, is the strongest statement of all. Jason sat alone in the study, looking at the notes in front of him. Each line represented a step closer to an unavoidable ending. He felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory, only an evident feeling. He was doing what needed to be done, not to teach Megan a lesson, but to save himself from being reduced to a number in someone else's story. Jason knew the most challenging part still lay ahead, the moment when he would have to look Megan straight in the eye and speak the truth. But for now, there was no need to rush. He had gone far enough to know he would not turn back. And for the first time in a very long while, Jason felt something close to peace. Not because everything was resolved, but because he was no longer lying to himself. That afternoon, when Jason received a message from Angela asking him to come back to the law office, he knew he was approaching the final boundary between waiting and action. This was no longer a phase of observation, no longer quiet note-taking. The test was over. The truth was complete. And now, everything had to be placed on the table, not through emotion, but through choice. Jason drove through the familiar streets of Denver with an unfamiliar state of mind. He wasn't rushing, he wasn't restless, and there was no longer even a fragile hope that things could somehow be reversed. What he felt was like standing in front of a door that had been closed for a long time and finally deciding to open it, knowing that what lay behind it was no longer what you once hoped for. But at least you would no longer have to guess. Angela greeted him with a brief nod. On the table lay a thin but neatly organized file with nothing unnecessary inside. She didn't speak much. She pointed to each item, each piece of evidence, each next step. Her voice was even, firm, and unemotional. That was what made Jason feel relieved. No one here was judging Megan. No one was calling her a betrayer. Everything revolved around a single question. How would Jason leave this marriage without losing himself? Angela told him that timing was the critical factor, not for legal advantage, but for psychology. Megan still believed she was in control of the situation. She believed Jason was weak, confused, and afraid. That belief made her careless. And sometimes, the truth needs to be revealed at the right moment, so there is no room left for denial. Jason nodded, listening carefully, committing everything to memory. When Angela asked whether he was certain, he answered immediately. I'm sure. No hesitation, no trembling. He didn't say that he no longer loved Megan. He only knew he could not continue living in a relationship where trust had been reduced to a monetary value. That evening, Jason came home earlier than usual. Megan was in the kitchen preparing dinner. The smell of food filled the house, so familiar it hurt. She turned around and smiled when she saw him. You're home early today? Jason nodded and set his keys on the table. He looked at Megan for a long moment before speaking, not to search for old feelings, but to confirm that he was ready. We need to talk, he said. His voice was so calm that even he was surprised. Megan paused for a second, then nodded. Okay, let me finish this first. Jason shook his head slightly. Now. Something in the way he said it made Megan stop completely. She wiped her hands on a towel and sat down in the chair across from him. For the first time in many days, Jason saw a genuine flicker of caution in her eyes. He didn't beat around the bush. He didn't recount long, emotional details. Jason spoke only the truth, piece by piece, slowly, clearly. That he hadn't been fired, that it had been a test, that he had heard the phone call, that he knew about the 5-year mark, about alimony, about the numbers that had already been calculated. Each sentence he spoke landed like a stone placed on the table between them. Megan didn't react immediately. Her face gradually paled, not from shame, but because the plan in her mind was collapsing. "You listened in on me?" she asked, her voice rising. Jason nodded. "I listened to the truth." He didn't justify himself. He didn't apologize. He understood that at this point, any apology would be seen as a sign of weakness. The conversation didn't explode into the shouting match Jason had once imagined. It was cold. Cold enough to hurt. Megan moved quickly from denial to anger, then to calculation. She asked about evidence, asked about the law, asked about the possibility of a court. Jason answered briefly. He didn't threaten her. He said he was prepared. When Megan fell silent, Jason presented the choice. Not an ultimatum, but a clear path, a fair agreement. No alimony, no prolonged legal battle. Each person keeps what belongs to them. He said that if it went to court, he would not humiliate her. He would only present the truth, and that truth would be enough to change everything. Megan let out a dry laugh. "You think you're so noble." Jason didn't respond. He didn't need to prove that. He only needed to protect his boundaries. In that moment, he realized that the woman sitting in front of him was no longer the person he had loved, but a distorted version, distorted by fear and ambition, and he could not save someone who did not want to be saved. The conversation ended without promises, without emotional compromise. Megan stood up and said she needed time to think. Jason nodded. He didn't stop her. When she walked upstairs, he remained alone in the living room, looking around the house that had once been filled with shared plans. He didn't feel empty. He just felt lighter. That night, Jason didn't sleep, but for the first time in weeks, he wasn't tormented by the question, what if? Everything was clear. He knew he would lose a marriage, but he also knew he had regained something far more critical: the right to live without doubting his own worth. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the window, Jason woke with a strange feeling. Not grief, not excitement, but inner stillness. He knew the road ahead would still be difficult: paperwork, confrontation, harsh words. But he also knew that from the moment he chose to face the truth, he was no longer being led. Some marriages don't end because of a lack of love, but because one person has stopped seeing love as the purpose. Jason understood that all too clearly. And in the silence of that morning, he told himself a simple sentence, like a promise to his own soul. From this day forward, he would never again allow himself to become a number in someone else's story. That morning began like any other, but Jason knew with absolute clarity that everything had changed forever. Not because of the conversation the night before, but because, for the first time in months, he woke up without the feeling that he was playing a role. The house was the same. Sunlight still streamed through the kitchen window. The wall clock still ticked in its steady rhythm. But inside Jason, a door had closed. No noise, no drama. Just an obvious ending. Megan woke up later than usual. When she came downstairs, Jason was making coffee. For the first few seconds, neither of them spoke. The air between them was no longer tense in an explosive way. It was an emptiness that was hard to name. Megan sat at the table and looked at Jason for a long time, as if trying to read something from his face. But Jason didn't give her that. He wasn't cold. He wasn't soft. He was simply someone who knew exactly where he stood. "I've been thinking all night," Megan finally said, her voice slow and subdued. "What happened yesterday, it wasn't fair." Jason set his coffee cup down and sat across from her. "I didn't say it was fair," he replied. "I said it was the truth." Megan pressed her lips together. "You deceived me." Jason nodded. "Yes, I lied. But I lied to understand who I was living with." He didn't add anything else. He let the sentence remain there, like a mirror placed between them. Megan began talking more. She spoke about pressure, about fear of the future, about not wanting to be left with nothing if everything collapsed. She said she never thought things would go this far. Jason listened, but he didn't get pulled in. He realized something crucial. Megan wasn't talking about lost love. She was talking about threatened security. "I'm not a bad person," Megan said, as if convincing herself. "I just wanted to make sure I wouldn't end up with nothing if it all ended." Jason looked at her. There was no anger in his eyes, no contempt, only a very quiet sadness. "And that's exactly the problem, Megan," he said. "The moment you started preparing to leave, you had already left. You just hadn't packed a suitcase yet." The words silenced her. For the first time, Jason saw fundamental uncertainty in her, not calculation, not defense, but a fleeting moment of realization that something had been lost and could not be recovered. The days that followed passed in a suspended state. They still lived in the same house, but they were no longer a couple. Megan became more cautious. She no longer asked Jason directly about money, but Jason knew the calculations were still happening in her mind. The difference was, she no longer held the advantage. Jason continued meeting with Angela. Each meeting made him feel more grounded. Angela didn't pressure him. She reminded him of only one thing: don't let last-minute emotions make you forget what you heard with your own ears. Jason understood. He could empathize with Megan's fear, but he could not sacrifice his future to soothe it. One afternoon, Jason came home to find Megan sitting at the dining table with a stack of papers in front of her. She looked up as he entered. "My lawyer," she said. No further explanation was needed. Jason nodded and pulled out a chair to sit down. He wasn't surprised. In fact, he felt relieved. At least now things were moving in the open. No more false layers. The conversation that day lasted more than 2 hours. No raised voices, no tears, just two adults dismantling a marriage that had once been built on hope. Megan brought up alimony. Jason didn't argue. He said only one sentence: "I will not pay money to compensate for the fact that you stayed for personal gain." It wasn't an attack. It was a boundary. And Megan understood it. She disagreed immediately, but she understood that Jason would not step back, not out of stubbornness, but because stepping back would mean betraying himself. That night, Jason packed a few personal belongings. Not to leave immediately, but to prepare. Each item he picked up carried a memory, but he didn't let himself sink into them. He understood that memories cannot justify continuing something that has lost its foundation. Love, without honesty, is nothing more than a habit dressed up with a beautiful name. The next morning, Jason left the house early. He drove without turning on the music, letting his thoughts move freely. He no longer asked himself, "Was I wrong?" That question had already been answered by Megan's actions, not her words. He began thinking about life ahead: a smaller apartment, a new routine, a version of himself who no longer had to measure every word inside his own home. There was a brief moment as he parked outside the office when sadness washed over him. Not because he lost Megan, but because he lost faith in a story he once believed was real. The feeling didn't last. It was replaced by something more profound, more solid. Self-respect. That evening, when Jason returned home, Megan was out. The house was tranquil. Jason stood in the middle of the living room, looking around. He no longer saw it as our home, just a space two people had once shared. And that realization didn't hurt the way he had expected. It simply taught him that people can adapt to the truth faster than they think, as long as they stop trying to deny it. Before going to bed, Jason sent a short message to Angela. "I'm ready." No emotion, no explanation, just a statement. As he put his phone down, he felt an unfamiliar sense of calm. Not because everything was finished, but because he had chosen the right side. The side of truth, of boundaries, of himself. The hardest part of this journey was no longer discovering the betrayal. That part was already behind him. From this point forward, every step Jason took was a step ahead. And no matter how lonely that road might be, he knew one thing for sure. It is better to walk alone in honesty than to stay in a relationship where love has been weighed and priced like a commodity. That Thursday afternoon, Jason was sitting in his office staring at his computer screen without actually reading a single line. Work continued as usual. Emails kept coming in. The phone kept vibrating, but his mind was somewhere else. He knew this moment would come. If not today, then tomorrow. There was nothing left to delay. When his phone vibrated again, this time with a message from Angela, his heart skipped a beat. "It's done. The filing was submitted at 2:47 p.m. She will be served today." Jason didn't reply immediately. He placed the phone on the desk, took a deep breath, then exhaled slowly. There was no sense of victory, no satisfaction, just a cold confirmation that the path he had chosen now had no more turns. This marriage, in legal terms, had officially entered its final chapter. He sat there for a few more minutes, making sure his outward appearance didn't change. A colleague walked by and nodded in greeting. Jason nodded back. No one knew that somewhere else in the city a woman was receiving an envelope that would collapse an entire plan she believed had been calculated to perfection. Jason's phone vibrated again. This time it wasn't a message. It was a call. Megan's name appeared on the screen. He looked at it for a few seconds, letting it ring. Part of him wanted to hear what her voice would sound like when everything was no longer under her control. Another part understood that this brief silence was also a way for him to maintain the upper hand. On the fourth ring, he answered. "Jason, what the hell is this?" Megan's voice on the other end wasn't shaking with heartbreak. It was trembling with anger. "I was just served divorce papers right in front of my class. Do you have any idea how humiliating that is?" Jason leaned back in his chair, keeping his voice calm. "I think the documents explain everything quite clearly." "You can't do this!" Megan nearly shouted. "We weren't done talking. You lost your job just a few days ago, and now you're filing for divorce?" Jason closed his eyes for a second. "I didn't lose my job," he said slowly. "I lied." A deadly silence stretched across the line. Jason could picture Megan's face, confusion spreading faster than anger. "What?" Her voice dropped, almost to a whisper. "I wasn't fired," Jason continued. "It was a test, and you answered it very clearly. You lied to trap me?" Megan was breathing fast. "You listened in on me?" "I heard the truth," Jason replied. "I heard you talk about the 5-year mark, about alimony, about how you no longer loved me but stayed for the benefits. That's not how it was, Megan shot back, but her voice lacked conviction. I was just venting. Everyone complains to their friends sometimes. Jason didn't laugh. He didn't mock her. Venting doesn't come with spreadsheets, he said. You mentioned exact numbers, every account. That wasn't a moment of emotion. That was a plan. Megan fell silent. Jason heard heavy breathing, footsteps, then the sound of a door slamming shut. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, colder, more calculated. So you think you're going to win? You think one recording is enough? I'm not thinking about winning or losing, Jason replied. I'm thinking about ending this the right way. You're destroying me, Megan said bitterly. Do you have any idea how I planned my future? Jason tightened his grip slightly. I do, he said, and that's exactly why I'm doing this. The call ended without a goodbye. Megan hung up. Jason set the phone down on his desk and looked out the window. The city was still loud. Cars still moved through the streets. The lives of millions of people continued. Only one marriage had just officially entered an irreversible stage. That afternoon, Jason didn't go home right away. He drove aimlessly around the city, giving his emotions space to settle. He didn't feel as empty as he had imagined. He didn't feel like a victim either. What he felt most clearly was relief mixed with exhaustion. Exhaustion because everything had finally been dragged into the light. Relief because he no longer had to play the role of the naive husband in his own story. By the time Jason arrived home, it was already dark. The lights were on and Megan's car was still in the driveway. He walked inside and found her standing in the middle of the living room, holding the papers she had just been served. Her eyes were red, but her gaze was sharp. Are you satisfied now? Megan asked. Your plan worked perfectly. Jason set his keys down, leaving his coat on. This isn't a plan, he said. It's a consequence. Megan scoffed. You think you're a good person? Lying to me, recording me, then pretending to be noble? Jason looked straight at her. I never thought I was noble, he said. I just know I won't continue being an investment waiting to mature. The words made Megan freeze. For a brief moment, her defenses cracked, but they were quickly rebuilt. I won't sign anything, she said. I'll take this to court. That's your right, Jason replied, and that's exactly why I'm prepared. There was nothing more to say. Megan turned and went upstairs. Jason remained alone in the living room, listening to her footsteps fade away. He didn't follow her. He knew the real confrontation wasn't in heated words, but in the cold decisions that had already been made. That night, Jason packed a small suitcase. Not everything, just the essentials. Clothes, a few books, his laptop. He wasn't running away. He was creating distance. Before leaving, he stood at the door for a long moment, looking around the space that had once been filled with shared plans. He felt no resentment, only an obvious ending. As he closed the door behind him, Jason understood that some moments in life are not marked by applause or congratulations. They are marked by silence. And in that silence, a person steps out of an old role, carrying their dignity with them, even if the price is an entire marriage. Jason did not return to that house that night. He drove instead to Marcus's apartment, the close friend who had told him long ago that if there ever came a day when Jason needed a temporary place to stay, his door would always be open. Marcus didn't ask many questions. He looked at Jason's exhausted yet composed face, nodded, and handed him the key to the living room. Sometimes, friendship doesn't require explanations. It only requires being there at the right moment. That night, Jason lay on an unfamiliar bed. The ceiling was lower, and the streetlights outside filtered through the curtains, casting uneven streaks of light across the room. He didn't fall asleep right away, but he didn't toss and turn as he had on previous nights either. What he felt wasn't sharp pain, but an organized emptiness. Like after a long psychological surgery when you know the worst part has been removed, but the body still needs time to adjust. The next morning, Jason woke early. He made coffee, opened his laptop, and reread Angela's email. Every line was clear, precise, stripped of unnecessary emotion. She reminded him of the following steps, what might happen in the coming days, and, most importantly, a brief warning. Megan would not readily accept losing control. She would react, not out of love, but because her plan had been disrupted. Jason understood that. In truth, he had been preparing himself for this moment ever since he heard that phone call on the staircase. When someone is accustomed to calculating, they don't let go of the moment the math stops working in their favor. They try to change the formula. At noon, Angela called Jason. Her voice was calm but sharp. "She's contacted her own lawyer," Angela said. "They'll challenge your evidence. They'll claim manipulation, that you set a trap, that the recording violates privacy." Jason listened without interrupting. "That's not surprising," he replied. Angela gave a small laugh. "Good. You're in the right mindset." 2 days later, Jason returned to the old house with Marcus to collect more of his belongings. Megan wasn't there. The familiar space suddenly felt foreign. The photos on the walls, the things they had once bought together, everything carried a different meaning now. They were no longer warm memories, but remnants of a story that had already ended. Jason didn't linger. He took only what he needed, no more, no less. He didn't want to turn this into an emotional division of property. That evening, Angela sent Jason a draft of the settlement agreement. Concise, clear. No alimony. Assets are divided strictly in accordance with the law. No prolonged disputes. Jason read every line carefully. He found no punishment in it, only a fair ending. He signed his name without hesitation. The next morning, Megan called again. Her voice was completely different from before. No explosions, no rage. It was cold, low, and calculating. "My lawyer says that recording may not be admissible," she said. "You're a bit too confident." Jason didn't respond right away. He let Megan continue. She listed possibilities, scenarios, everything she believed she might still be able to claim. When Megan finally fell silent, Jason spoke. "I don't need the recording to prove you were preparing to leave," he said. "I have credit card statements. I have records of your meetings with a lawyer months ago. I have the changes you made in the house. If this goes to court, you'll have to explain all of it. Under oath." A long pause followed. Jason heard Megan's breathing slow. "What do you want?" she asked. To Jason, that question was the final, clearest revelation of what this marriage truly was. Not what will happen to us, but what do you want? "I want it to end," Jason replied, quietly, without dragging it out, without turning this marriage into a transaction. Megan gave a thin laugh. "You think you're being noble?" Jason didn't argue. "I think I'm doing what's necessary," he said, "for both of us." The call ended without a goodbye, but this time Jason felt an apparent shift. Megan was no longer in control. She was no longer speaking like someone waiting for a return on investment. She was speaking like someone trying to minimize losses. The days that followed passed slowly. Jason returned to his work routine. He focused more than ever. Every morning he went for a run. Every evening he read or sat quietly, letting his mind rest. For the first time in a long while, he didn't have to wonder what his wife was thinking. And that quiet, though empty at first, gradually became a form of freedom. One afternoon, Angela called again. "They want to negotiate," she said. They're offering a small amount, not calling it alimony, but transitional support. Jason was silent for a few seconds. No, he said. Not angrily, not rigidly, just firmly. Angela nodded, though Jason couldn't see her. I thought so too. That evening, Jason sat alone on the balcony of Marcus's apartment. The city lights came on. Familiar sounds drifted up from below. He thought about Megan, not with resentment, but with a quiet sadness. He realized that at some point they had truly loved each other. But that love had been distorted by fear, by toxic whispers, and by turning the future into a spreadsheet. Jason understood that this part of the story didn't have a loud climax. There was no triumphant victory. Only decisions made in silence and consequences that had to be accepted. But sometimes, that silence is the clearest sign of maturity. Not every ending needs an explosion. Some endings only need one person clear-headed enough to say, "This is enough." When Jason stood up, turned off the light, and went back inside, he knew that the most extraordinary confrontation was already behind him. What remained were procedures and time. And for the first time in many months, he felt that he was no longer being pulled backwards by a story that no longer belonged to him. The weeks that followed moved slowly. Not because nothing was happening, but because every development carried a psychological weight heavier than Jason had ever expected. Once the initial shock faded, once the angry phone calls gradually gave way to calculated silence, Jason understood that this story was not over. It was simply moving into a deeper layer, one where it was no longer about who won or lost, but about who would ultimately have to face the real consequences of choices made long ago. Jason moved into a small one-bedroom apartment in the northern part of the city. It wasn't spacious, it wasn't luxurious, but it was bright enough and quiet enough. He bought a simple wooden table, a work chair, and a few necessities. He didn't decorate much. He didn't try to turn the place into a home right away. He only needed a space without shared memories, without conversation suspended between two people who no longer stood on the same ground. Each evening, after work, he returned to that apartment and noticed something unfamiliar. The silence no longer frightened him. It began to feel like a new companion, quiet, but honest. On the other side, Megan did not remain silent. She called Jason several times, not screaming, not accusing, but speaking in the tone of someone trying to shift the balance. She talked about the years she had devoted to the marriage, about what she claimed to have sacrificed, about feeling betrayed because Jason had set her up. Jason listened, but he didn't get pulled in. He noticed a common thread in every conversation. Megan always spoke about what she believed she deserved, never about what had been lost between them. Angela remained the most stable voice during this period. She kept Jason informed of every move from Megan's legal team. They tried proposing different settlements, softening language, renaming payments, and attempting to make everything look less like alimony. Jason refused consistently, not because he wanted to punish Megan, but because every time he considered conceding, he remembered that voice from the night on the stairs. The voice that had spoken clearly and calmly about a marriage viewed as an investment, waiting to generate returns. One late afternoon, just as Jason finished work, his phone vibrated with an unfamiliar number. He almost ignored it, but answered anyway. The voice on the other end was female and slightly trembling. Not Megan. "Jason, it's me, Lauren." Just hearing the name tightened something in his chest. Lauren was the close friend who had appeared repeatedly in the conversations he overheard on the stairs, the name tied to those cold calculations. "I know I don't have the right to call you," Lauren continued, "but I need to talk. Not because of Megan. Because of me." Jason stayed silent for a few seconds before responding. Part of him wanted to refuse immediately, but another part, the part exhausted by unanswered questions, wanted to hear what she had to say. In the end, he agreed to meet her at a cafe in the city center, a place he had never visited with Megan. He wanted neutral ground, untouched by memory. Lauren arrived a few minutes late. When she walked in, Jason immediately noticed how different she looked from the photos he had seen. Her face was tired. Her eyes were sunken. Her hands clenched tightly around her handbag as if searching for something to hold on to. She didn't hesitate. "I'm sorry," Lauren said as soon as she sat down. "I'm sorry for my part in all of this." Jason didn't respond. He looked at her and waited. Lauren spoke in broken phrases about her own divorce 2 years earlier, about the bitterness of watching her ex-husband move on as if nothing had happened, about the settlement money. She saw it as the only compensation for the years she felt used, and about how, during Megan's seemingly ordinary complaints about Jason, Lauren had pushed her advice further than she should have. "I told her that at least you made good money," Lauren admitted. "That if she'd already stayed almost 5 years, she should wait until it was 5. I didn't think it would turn into this." Jason listened without interrupting. When Lauren finished, he didn't feel relieved. He didn't feel vindicated. Only a heavy sadness. He understood that quiet influences can push a person off course, but he also understood something else. Influence never replaces choice. "You didn't force Megan to do what she did," Jason said finally, his voice calm. "You spoke. Megan decided." Lauren nodded, tears falling. "I know, and that's something I have to live with." She hesitated, then continued, as if summoning courage. "Megan is falling apart. Not because of the money, but because for the first time she has to face the fact that she's become someone she once looked down on." Jason didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure how he was supposed to feel about that. The meeting ended in silence. There was no reconciliation, no promises. When Lauren left, Jason stayed behind, staring at his now cold coffee. He didn't know whether the conversation would change anything, but it made him see the story differently, not simply as betrayal, but as a chain of poor choices nurtured by fear and toxic advice. That evening, Jason returned to his apartment and opened his computer, scrolling through old photos. Not out of nostalgia, but to understand. He saw Megan on their wedding day, eyes bright and trusting. He saw trips they'd taken, moments that had been real. He wondered when things had started to shift. Maybe there was no single moment. Maybe it was a slippery slope where every small step felt reasonable until you looked back and realized you'd gone too far. In the days that followed, Angela reported that Megan's side was gradually softening. No greater demands, no more rigid declarations. Instead, cautious inquiries, tentative proposals. Jason didn't feel pleased. He just felt tired. Tired because everything could have been so much simpler if honesty had arrived sooner. One late evening, Jason stood by the apartment window, looking down at the stream of cars below. He thought about Lauren, about Megan, about himself. He realized that the most challenging part of this story wasn't protecting assets or winning a legal dispute. The hardest part was accepting that the people we love can become versions of themselves we no longer recognize, and that sometimes leaving isn't betrayal. It's the only way not to betray yourself. Jason knew this chapter was nearing its end, not with an explosion, but with exhaustion and acceptance. And in the quiet of the room, he understood one more thing. Not everyone who causes harm is a bad person, but that doesn't mean you have to stay and endure it. Some stories don't end with applause. There is no climactic moment bathed in dazzling lights. No one stands on a podium declaring victory. This story is one of them. It ends with a man sitting alone in a small apartment on an ordinary evening, looking out at a city lighting up and realizing that his life has taken a different direction. Not loudly, not tragically, but irreversibly. Jason doesn't become a hero. He doesn't become a man seeking revenge. He becomes someone who looked straight at the truth and chose to stop lying to himself. His marriage didn't collapse overnight. It didn't fall apart because of one explosive argument. It died slowly, in silence, in calculations, in carefully awaited timelines. One person is staying not out of love, but while waiting for the most advantageous moment to leave. And when Jason realized that, he stood before a choice that many of us have faced, or will face at least once in our lives. Stay in a relationship without honesty, or leave, carrying pain but keeping dignity. He chose to leave, not because he stopped loving, but because he understood that love cannot survive when measured by money, benefits, or personal security. Love is not an investment waiting to yield returns, and marriage is not a contract where one side secretly prepares an exit clause. Jason protected himself, not with bitterness, not with retaliation, but with clarity. He didn't take more than he deserved, and he didn't give away what was never asked for in sincerity. And in that calmness, he ended not only a marriage, but also a version of himself, the version willing to stay silent to keep the peace, willing to doubt himself to avoid conflict, willing to sacrifice the truth to preserve an image of stability. This story isn't just about Jason. It's about many of us. People who have been in relationships where something felt off, but couldn't quite name it. People who asked themselves, maybe I'm just being too sensitive. People who accepted minor signs, then larger ones, until they no longer knew where the boundary was. And it's also a story about an uncomfortable truth. Not everyone who hurts you was a bad person from the beginning. Some people truly loved once, but out of fear, under the influence of others, because of old wounds left unhealed, they slowly turn love into something that needs to be controlled. That may explain behavior, but it does not justify causing harm. Jason understood that, and so he didn't carry hatred with him. He carried a lesson. He learned that people reveal who they truly are most clearly when their interests are threatened. Some reveal greed, some reveal weakness, and some, after failing, choose to grow. He also learned that forgiveness does not mean saying what happened was right. Forgiveness is the decision not to let the past continue to control your future. Jason didn't want to go back. He forgave to move forward. And that may be the deepest part of this story. Because sometimes the most satisfying ending isn't watching someone else pay, but watching yourself walk out of the wreckage with your inner self still intact. If you're watching this story and something in it resonates with you, maybe you're not in Jason's situation exactly, but perhaps you're in a relationship, a situation, or a season of life where you constantly have to convince yourself that everything is fine. Remember this. Your intuition is not your enemy. The truth isn't always comfortable, but it is always liberating. And you don't owe anyone your presence in a place that makes you lose yourself. At Deep Life Tales, we don't tell stories so you can judge who's right or wrong. We ask them to remind you that life is more complex than simple moral labels, that people can make mistakes, lose their way, and still choose to grow, and that sometimes the bravest thing isn't enduring, It's letting go. If this story made you reflect, please hit like to support the channel. Share it if you think someone out there needs to hear it. And leave a comment, not to argue, but to speak your truth. What would you do if you were in Jason's place? Don't forget to subscribe to Deep Life Tales to continue walking with us through real-life stories. Stories that don't promise miracles, but always offer truth, depth, and a chance for us to understand ourselves a little better. Thank you for staying until the very end. See you in the following story.